Good afternoon. Today is Monday, the 6th of May, 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. I'm delighted to have with me Diane McAdie, who'll be speaking from Scotland. We've got Mark Anderson speaking from the United States, and we've got Alex Thomson talking to us from Georgia in the former Soviet Republic. Well, let's get straight off because we've got a lot in today's news, a lot of very interesting topics. And of course, I hope that our viewers and listeners appreciate the dedication. We're here on a holiday, a public holiday in UK to serve your needs. Alex, it's good to see you. You're looking very relaxed. Tell us where you are and what have you got for us?
Greetings, Brian and Diane and Mark and the viewers from sunny Tbilisi, the capital of the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, a long banana-shaped city in a beautiful location on the river Mtkwari. By far the biggest city in the country. I come here about once a year on average, my former specialist domain. I landed on Saturday, and this is the scene that greeted me at the airport as I was picking my baggage off the carousel. We'll play this silently as I continue to talk. So the carousel shows, or the screens on the carousel show Georgia's pride that all of their sporting teams are doing brilliantly. The first one you saw there was Georgia has qualified for the UEFA Cup for the first time in its history and will be playing Turkey at Dortmund Stadium on the 18th of June. And look at all these excellent sportsmen in the various domains. It all looks very hunky-dory, but Brian, this is a more tense Georgia than I have ever seen, and this is having covered, although not lived here through, but having covered several revolutions and wars in Georgia. I haven't seen society this divided, even this morning. I mean, the usual measure is, of course, the taxi drivers, and the younger ones, the ones that look more Western in their styling, shall we say, have a particular intolerance now towards anything associated with the Georgian Orthodox Church or Christian culture in general, and anything that they don't like, they spit on as being Russian, with a hardness that I didn't see even in the previous revolutionary period, the Rose Revolution of 20 years ago under Mikhail Saakashvili. However, the point of the matter, and I won't show any footage of riots today because everyone's away for Orthodox Easter over this long weekend, so that would not be current, but in a couple of days' time, and certainly by my next appearance next Wednesday, God willing, that I'm afraid there probably will be more gory footage of police laying in with tear gas and water cannons. The issue of contention is a draft bill tabled by the government and put through to Parliament on the requirement to register foreign non-governmental organisations. For short, this is being called the Foreign Agents Registration Bill and is being compared with the Kremlin's already enacted bill of the same name, which went through the Duma. And you will hear in a moment a BBC interview with a member of parliament for the ruling party, the Georgian Dream Party, called Nicholas Samkharadze, where he defends this position and he gets laid into by the BBC. We'll discuss that in a moment. But before this point in the interview, Mr. Samkharadze has laid out fairly even-handedly that Georgia does face massive territorial challenges from Russia occupying Abkhazia and South Ossetia and from the various wars around the periphery between Armenia and Azerbaijan just down the road from here. That's fair enough. And then he gets to the point we'll be listening to now for about a minute and a half, where he explains the necessity of the law. So let's roll that.
We have 25,000 active non-governmental organizations working in Georgia, which is one of the highest per capita index in the world, given the fact that Georgia is 3.7 million, Georgia's population, and that makes almost one NGO per 148 Georgian citizen. And 90% of those non-governmental organizations get their funding from foreign sources. And there is no accountability. There is no transparency of where the funds come from and for what purposes these funds are spent for. Therefore, for us, this is important to ensure the transparency of foreign funding.
But this law would go, if I may interrupt, this law would go even further than Russia's similar law does. For example, the Russian law exempts religious organizations from this act. It doesn't call them foreign agents. The proposal that you are putting forward would classify religious organizations who receive that level of funding from abroad as foreign agents. So why do you feel the need to include, for example, religious groups in this?
let me be clear, there is no word agent mentioned in the draft legislation.
Now, with the possible exception of that very last sentence, which is disputed by those who've read the text in Georgian closely, that they say there is reference to foreign agents. Georgia doesn't quite have a word for agent, but similar wording. The rest of what Mr. Samkaradze says, I have to say, is fairly unobjectionable in my view. And Samkaradze cannot be pigeonholed as a Russian stooge. True, he belongs to the Georgian Dream ruling party, which is often accused of being a front for the pro-Russian oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili. But on the other hand, if you look at his career, which will be in the show notes, although I'm told by Kenny, interestingly enough, that Western ISPs block the Georgian Parliament web server, so you can't read the biography. I don't know why. But if you look at his biography, he spent the last 20 years, including during the Saakashvili period, being a pro-Western reformer and advisor on security, and he's an academic on defense policy and security issues, territorial integrity of Georgia, which is such a hot topic here. So you could say that the middle section of Georgian society, perhaps the middle class and the early middle age like him, are thinking this way, but the radicalism starts just a few years below him. Down the road in Armenia, there will be probably more on this as well next week. We'll see that it's behind a paywall, but I'll read a bit in a moment. Intelligence Online is reporting that Yerevan, which is swinging very much towards France, NATO and the West, the capital of Armenia, that government has now hired none other than General Sir Richard Dannatt, the former Chief of Staff of the British Army, what's left of it, who's now taken up with the successor to the defunct and ill-reputed PR firm Bell Pottinger, responsible for many ethnic issues around the world, here in the Caucasus and elsewhere. Dannatt apparently is going to be advising the government of Nikol Pashinyan, the Prime Minister of Armenia, on burnishing his image, particularly with reference to the military. And he'll be working alongside another former Cameron advisor at Sanctuary Council, the new front for Bell Pottinger, and that will be Andrew Cooper, who's now Baron Cooper of Windrush. Australian spin doctor Linton Crosby, known to our viewers, is also in the mix. And the Times of London reported on the 15th of April that the British and Armenian governments are already discussing turning Armenia into a second Rwanda, making it a pro-Western client government to the extent that it gets British applicants for British asylum dumped there because it's supposedly a low-cost country difficult to get out of. And a final slide from me in this segment, one of our viewers has spotted that this small US Air Force VIP-type plane has been flying from Tbilisi to the Azerbaijani capital of Baku, both pro-NATO and EU countries that may be members of both soon, possibly shuttling State Department diplomats back and forth. By next Wednesday, there'll probably be a lot more to report in regard to both of these things.
Alex, thank you very much. Very interesting report. Sad, though, we've got more angst and stress occurring in Georgia. We've already got enough problems with Ukraine. Let's have a look at what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. But I'm going to start with this appalling tweet from the British Ministry of Defence. I've just put a little bit of text to go with that, if we can pop that on screen. So the fact is that Ukraine is losing the war at the moment. There's no question to this. But let's have a look at how the UK Ministry of Defence responds. I'm calling this hype and propaganda. Let's look at this dreadful clip that they've put out.
Загалом я студент Харківської академії дизайну.
My name is Sophia. I am a combat medic in the Ukrainian army, and first of all, I'm a student. I'm still a student. I'm studying painting at the university, like different kind of painting and painting techniques. And when the full-scale invasion started, I joined the Ukrainian army, and now I'm serving in the Ukrainian army, and I'm going to do this until it ends. I will be in the army until it ends, it's for sure. So I like all these tactics and everything. I want to explore this, to understand more. But when the war ends, maybe I will do the thing I started doing before the war. I will restore pieces of art, and maybe I will restore everything which Russians destroyed during this war. It's my small dream.
So that young lady has a dream. Let's have a look at the battle into which she is going to go. She's been trained how to use a rifle. Let's see what she's really going to be up against. Now, I've got some video clips. I'm going to talk through this. This is Chasiv, the suburbs. This is the next key city for the Russians because it's on high ground. And of course, what we're seeing in the picture, as always, is that it's the concrete-built high-rise buildings that form defensive positions for the forces. Ukrainians or the Russians to that effect, but you will see that the surrounding land is very flat. There's very little cover apart from the tree lines, and what is the result? The Russians are bombing the Ukrainians out of any defensive position. So rifles effectively useless in the first instance due to the heavy pressure of the Russian bombing. But if we look at the destruction here, it's massive, and then ultimately each one of these buildings has to be taken by foot soldiers on the ground. And if we look onto the horizon, we can see the the tree areas which form other defensive positions. So if we have a look in detail at the types of weapons being used, this shows the power of the Russian guided bombs, where they simply take out a building the moment they know what it's used for, and you can see the size of the explosion here. I'm going to suggest that young lady is one of many thousands of Ukrainians being trained to die because they're not being trained for the warfare that they're going to experience. The size of the bombs is absolutely massive, 500 kilograms, 1,000, 1,500, or even 3,000, and extremely accurate. If we move on to the next little clip, we start to let's leave this one running. This one, I think we're seeing thermobaric weapons being used, and these are absolutely targeted at Ukrainians in the tree lines. But we've got more here showing the accuracy of these weapons. And very often the Russians are targeting the bases of the Ukrainian drone operators. So they're not wasting a few shells, they're simply obliterating the whole building and infrastructure around it with these immensely powerful and very accurate weapons. When it comes to air defensives, the Russians are still putting out incredible equipment onto the battlefield. So we've got a picture here of the Tor system, which is coming into an open area where admittedly they are vulnerable and many have been taken out by the Ukrainians. But nevertheless, we're seeing weapon systems that the West, NATO in particular at the moment, is having trouble keeping up with for their speed and accuracy. And of course, we've now got the situation where the Russians are fully combat trained in their use. So this piece of footage claims that the missile was taking out a drone. I can't see a larger target, so I'm going to take that at face value. But what's also happening on the battlefield is the Russians are hunting for the Abrams tanks, and this is a film clip showing the destruction of one such tank. Let's let this one play. What are we going to see here? Well, the missile comes in and strikes the tank very hard in this particular image. The tank isn't fully destroyed. I think I said missile, I should have said drone. But what then happens is that this particular tank is tracked and it's followed and it's attacked multiple times until it is finally destroyed. And we can see here the effect of the final destruction. The tragedy is some of the men get out. You can see them moving to the right of your screen, but I believe at least one of the crew members didn't. And if it comes to anti-tank weapons, then the Russian Kornet is achieving remarkable success on the battlefield. So, okay, this is a promotional film by the Russians themselves, but nevertheless, this shows the type of combat that's going on, where small numbers of vehicles are being used, and those are being attacked by drones and all these anti-tank guided weapons. And usually with a guided weapon, the destruction is complete, or with the crew or the soldiers who are travelling in the armoured vehicle. This is another Abrams tank taking a hit. And of course, this is completely removing the myth of the invincibility of Western weapons systems. And another picture of a destroyed vehicle here, which simply shows us that what we were told, that the Leopards and the Challengers and the Abraham tanks were going to win the war for Ukraine, simply not true. And as we speak, the Russians are making considerable progress on the battlefield, and the Ukrainians are having trouble re-establishing defensive lines. Now, I'll just put this on screen. This is part of a document that went to the US Committee of Congress, and in it it's saying that the American Excalibur precision artillery rounds initially had a 70% efficiency rate, hitting targets when first used in Ukraine. However, after a mere 6 weeks, efficiency declined to only 6% as the Russians adopted their electronic warfare system to counter it. So this is a very important statement, and it shows the reality on the battlefield, with the Ukrainians now under immense pressure because they're short of weapons and they're short of men. And on that topic, what is the Ukrainian response? Well, in this video, we will see how they're desperately trying to drag more men off the street. I don't know the location of this footage, but it's symptomatic in many of the eastern Ukrainian city urban areas where the squads are out in order to grab any young or indeed older man. And this clip here shows the sheer brutality of people being put into vehicles, taken away, given minimum training, and the reality is they're probably going to die on the battlefield. And what does that death look like? Well, I'm not going to show you the pictures, they're too harrowing, but in the next clip, if we pop that on screen, we can see just the sheer scale of just one military cemetery in Ukraine. And of course, the scale of the Ukrainian casualties simply not talked about in the Western media, because we must believe the illusion that the Ukrainians are winning this terrible war as puppets of NATO and the West. But the scale of this cemetery you can see for yourselves, and this is one of just many that are now there in Ukraine. Well, if we move on to Zelensky, he's been talking to the press, and if we just press the button on this one, play him in the background and have a look at the text we'll bring in. What is he saying? He's saying, really, trust me, Ukraine is going to fight to the last Ukrainian, and that last Ukrainian will be Zelensky. 2 armies have already gone. The third is falling apart on the battlefield at the moment, but he needs another 500,000 men. And he's also saying that his European friends are helping control his passport renewals to force Ukrainians out of hiding in European countries and back onto the battlefield, where they're almost certainly going to die. If we just, that's just an article from NBC News talking about the much needed conscripts. But if we go to this image from Handelsblad, short headline, but it says it all. Yes, dead, but with a new passport. And what this is getting at is that Ukrainians overseas are being forced to declare themselves because their passports are ineffective or they need renewing. And at that point, they're grabbed by the Ukrainian military. So if we just look at a bit more that's come from Zelensky himself, let's bring the text on screen. He's working hard, he says, with a peace summit in Switzerland. They're going to create a common understanding amongst the participating states with a view to achieving a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine. But no, Russia is not invited. And he says we expect 80 to 100 countries to be able at least to try to, quote, force Russia to a fair peace. But the reality is at the moment that Russia has had no invitation. This is the formal report here from Switzerland, all you need to know about the Ukraine Peace Summit. I won't read it all, but it's busily quoting international law and the UN Charter and it aims to create a common understanding of a framework favourable to this objective and a concrete roadmap for Russia's participation in the peace process. Here's The Guardian, and I throw this into the mix because it's very clear that the West sees that support for Ukraine is the same as support for Israel. Support for Israel is the same as Ukraine. But here's the journalist, Nathalie Tocker, and she is described as a Guardian Europe columnist. But if we get into the detail, she's been to Oxford, she's been to London School of Economics, she's worked with the European University Policy Studies, the Transatlantic Academy, Washington, and the European Council of Foreign Relations. And she's also acted as a counsellor in international strategic matters for Federica Mogherini. So I'm suggesting this lady is not just an ordinary journalist, she's something rather more. Now, Alex, against that pretty appalling background of what's happening on the battlefield, it looks as though there's worse in store from the West and NATO.
It does, Brian, but the matter is controversial. In particular, Finnish and French troops are now said by some sources, although unverified as far as I'm concerned, to be stationed in Ukraine, and not just in the rear, in the west of the country, but according to some accounts, near that front line in the Donbass and around Chasiv Yar, which seems to be about to fall. So Stephen Bryan, whose Substack is called Weapons and Strategy, has an overview of the current situation entitled NATO is starting to deploy troops in Ukraine, although he means individual NATO member states, of course, not NATO as a bloc. And he says Russia is racing to win. That is well worth a read. Embedded in that piece is this graphic from Rybar. Everyone will know, I think, who follows this, that Rybar is an unashamedly pro-Russian Telegram channel. There's no claim of impartiality here. But look, Rybar has what its prima facie says is photographic evidence of men with Finnish army and Finnish national patches, not just in the right bank or the west of the country, but way over in Kharkiv in the northeast, the second city of the country, around Korotych airfield. And it gets even more interesting. First of all, the aerial support. So this is from the middle of last month, but as of the 18th of April 2014, 3 Dutch F-16s were delivered to Ukraine. And there was a publicity stunt where people, including the Dutch Defense Minister Kajsa Ollongren, the lady you see second from right here, dressed up as if they were F-16 pilots and did the strut out to the 3 airframes, as tweeted by Sonja von den Ende, a dissident. The Asia Times, a legacy and quite mainstream and major Hong Kong-based title, which I admit has been pro-Russian in the past, and the claims here are contested, to my knowledge, also including by a Ukrainian defense attaché in a Ukrainian embassy abroad. But the claim is that Macron has sidestepped a sort of gentleman's understanding not to deploy French citizens as a NATO member state troops to Ukraine by allegedly using French Foreign Legion troops. The name and the reputation go before it. The Foreign Legion only recruits non-Frenchmen. And I do say the French men because it doesn't take women. The claim here in the Asia Times is that these men have been sent to support the Ukrainian 54th Independent Mechanized Brigade, so the guys who drive around at greater speed, but who are also able to fight as infantrymen, right over in Slovyansk in the Donbass. It's allegedly the 3rd Infantry Regiment of the Légion Étrangère that's involved. The officers are Frenchmen, the men under arms, men at arms are foreign. So we don't know whether that's confirmed or not. Reuters has egg on its face because people will be aware that there was a lot of talk about Cameron getting ahead of the curve, which we reported on, and giving away too much detail before the time. But now Reuters, as of last week, was obliged to retract its reporting, which it doesn't like doing often, but they had the integrity to do it. The placeholder simply says, as of the 2nd of May, 4 days ago, that their previous story, their previous wire saying that Cameron had promised aid to Ukraine on behalf of Britain had been withdrawn because they wanted to fact-check some of the details. This may or may not have to do with the Latvian foreign minister's recent claim that there was a list of NATO donor countries which had tacitly, under the table, told Ukraine that they were free to use the donated weapons directly against the Russians in Russian territory, may or may not. A lot of these things have to be taken with suspended judgment, I'm afraid, because much as people might think, well, they would deny it, wouldn't they? The Ukrainians are denying a lot of what's on here. This photographic evidence, again, has come from social media, from Vexa, and by a very reputable and reliable viewer of mine. And it purports to show, I'm no doubt that it does, US troops being photographed using Korean 155s, the big caliber shells that are the hardest to restock, that have the longest lead-in time, as people know who followed this. So it may be that South Korea is filling up Uncle Sam's empty war chest in that regard, because of the well-known problems with stocking. The viewer comment by the viewer who sent me not the previous photo, but the Asia Times piece before that, said this: Military Summary, a channel he trusts well, is reporting a heavy bombing attack in Mykolaiivka on the coast. He says most channels are reporting an energy facility to be the target, so that's a blackout strategy against the Ukrainians. However, he adds, a reliable Russian source is insisting that the first French contingent of 100 to 150 artillery specialists, the standard ruse of having a NATO man standing alongside the Ukrainians, training them so that you can plausibly thinly deny that they were firing at the Russians. He says that these French specialists were deployed to that very area, i.e. the Russians were having a go directly at them. On the next slide, which I won't read out in full, he reminds us, and we've played the Pyotr Tolstoy clip on French news, where he said, "We will kill your men that come to Ukraine." Russia has warned that they would do exactly that, whether it's Odessa or up in the front. If it sees NATO men, it will go for them. And of course, that's happened in the past in Kherson and in other places, Kharkiv too, where the French have lost men. The viewer asks, what the heck does Macron think he's doing, if confirmed? Finally, he says, this is an important claim because Macron has made statements on strategic ambiguity, making overtures to Putin, whether sincere or not. And he alludes to this reported list of nations who have said to the Ukrainians, sub rosa, go ahead and bash the Russians directly with our stuff, including on their own territory. And he notes, and this the same happened with Libya, with naval contretemps, there is an Italian Franco-Italian split. Yeah, the Italian foreign minister seems to have departed from the Macronian line in this regard. The viewer also reminded us of this, and it's just a quick snapshot I made because it's completely fresh. It will be in show notes. The leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives, so the majority leader in the lower house of Congress, has already said, Mr. Jeffries, that US will have to send troops to Ukraine, whether they're called NATO troops or not. That's supposedly a high probability. And I'll just round off this segment by reminding people that Rodney Atkinson, well known to our long-term viewers for his geopolitical commentary, notes that Chasiv is about to fall and has a lot of detail, which you can see, I won't read it out, on what's going on with Russians going very targetedly for warehouses and NATO troop locations, if they are now present, around the south and east of the country. And he notes that there are big problems with runaways, with discipline, desertion, corruption, the internal energy. And he's quoting a retired spook colonel, Mr. Starikov, as saying that we don't have a regular army in Ukraine anymore. The NATO trained army of just under 500,000 has largely been destroyed by the Russians. You reported on that before, Brian. And finally, this is picking up on a Der Spiegel piece behind a paywall. I'm sorry that it's German, but the commander of the Black Sea fleet that has been sent out to support the Ukrainians has said that he now has too few frigates at his disposal in order to guarantee the safety of merchant marine traffic. And he says that there's 2 or 3. This may exclude about another 2 or 3 French and Italian frigates, but even if we're generous, there's half a dozen frigates available now.
Alex, thank you very much. Well, it's a confused situation, but the Ukrainians are definitely suffering on the battlefield. I'll just put this meme up. I think this is so sad because it's an astute view of what's happening. So we've got American, British and European politicians laughing and saying, and then we told Zelensky, if you beat Russia, we'll let you join NATO. While this situation goes on, of course, hundreds of thousands of men and women are dying on the battlefield. Well, if you like what UK Column is doing as a news reporter, then please support us. That's very important for us. Please help us out financially by taking out a membership with us. It's a monthly subscription, and it is people who pay for us on a monthly basis that keep the UK column going. So if you're watching and you're new and you'd like to support us, have a look at the website and join in the UK column. Please share our material. Sorry, please purchase from the shop. Please share our material. And if you send our material out, please make sure that you acknowledge it's from the UK column. That's all we ask. Now, also, we've got a promotion here for part 3 of an article. And let's bring you in very briefly. Mark, tell us what this one's about.
This is the existing article, part 2. BBC's local democracy service broadens the mass media cartel's monopolistic network. This is just a reminder that this is up and it's an ongoing series. I've had 2 posts so far, and the third one is coming up. And what I may be looking at, Brian, is think tanks creating their own news organizations and pushing them as legitimate news, but coming directly from think tanks, not just reporters that have been affiliated with think tanks, like you mentioned, but actually directly from think tanks. So look for that fairly soon here at UKC. Okay, Mark, thank you very much. And we'll just have this on screen, a very nice letter. This is People's Assembly Somerset, who sent us a nice letter saying what they're doing, but also saying that they're helping to advertise the UK column. So people taking action in an appropriate way against local councils and sustainable 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and they're doing that by getting together. Now, Alex, just bring you back in very briefly, and the subject is Netanyahu and funding of Hamas.
I'm not a Middle East specialist, so I'll be very brief, but it is particularly notable because this has been broken by Ynet News, which to my mind is one of the 3 top mainstream or legacy Israeli news sites online that Israelis consult. Now they're admitting in a piece published yesterday that in a letter of 2018, Benjamin Netanyahu asked Qatar to fund Hamas, and that wasn't the first time they'd done it. They'd been doing so from 2007 to 2014, starting from about the time of that Gaza war. But it was done sporadically and off the books at first. And now it's come out that a handful of people in Tel Aviv knew that this was happening. And it was being tacitly accepted and nodded through by the Israelis. And then, according to Ynet, the war in Gaza in 2014, the second of these Gaza wars, was the turning point. All of the Westerners decided, together with the Qataris, that if you bunged $30 million at Hamas to buy stuff off the West and Israel, then they would give up on their plans militarily. So an act of sheer folly, whichever way you look at it, and something that has been very hotly denied by Israeli propaganda, but that's not credible anymore.
Alex, thank you. Things get more and more curious as to what is really going on. And let's bring you in, Diane, because you're having a look at the subject of decolonisation. And if people think that's a strange term, it is. But let's have a look at what is happening in the world around that particular term.
Thanks, Brian. I'm happy to be here, even though it is a bank holiday. So as a review, a few weeks ago, I covered the topic of decolonization and in universities. And essentially part of the agenda in universities, and it's spreading to other things, as we'll see here in just a minute, the idea that there are, in all situations, oppressors and oppressed groups. And according to the traditional definition of decolonization, anyone who is on the oppressed side of the equation is anyone who is not white. But we're seeing now that this is starting to spread into other areas, and potentially, I'm just going to throw it out there, really just as a question and discussion. So we'll bring this back to Gaza here in just a minute. But first, here's something that I saw over the weekend, which prompted me to want to talk about this. We are now paying, if you are in this particular council in the northeast of England, you are now funding a £475 a day expert to decolonize Hadrian's Wall itself. I don't know how you decolonize an actual wall, but the idea here is, and just to verify that I knew that I knew my history correctly, the Romans actually came and colonized here, and they built this wall. So the idea of decolonizing the wall because somehow the British Empire is somehow guilty of something is basically the idea behind this particular person being hired. We also see in the Brent Museum and Archive, which is in London, they are hiring a decolonization consultant for £5,000 for a short-term project. So we're seeing these kinds of efforts all over the UK and the US and Western societies in general. And this morning I just happened to see something on Sky News, which I didn't include in my slides. I can provide a link to it, though, if you'd like to see it, around the Joe Biden's administration that is going into northern Nevada, into a Native American area to mine lithium from the mountains up in northern Nevada. Now, in my mind, that is true colonization. In the meantime, we're worried about words and what we call things in library catalogs and what we call walls and things. And the priorities are just a little bit strange to me. So taking this back to Gaza, here we have a video, and I've got a few videos from a few different perspectives because this is a complicated situation of the pro-Palestine, pro-Israel, whatever you want to call it, basically against Gaza genocide, going around universities, which started in the United States and is now spreading to UK and Australia. So let's play this first one. This is from the 30th of April at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So there's a lot going on there. Just in that first clip, we see a group of students protecting the American flag on American soil. We see Palestine protesters throwing things at someone holding an Israeli flag. But there are several different perspectives to this. If we look at this next tweet here, this is a video which I won't show, but it's basically showing Jewish gangs attacking American students. And the video is saying that the Zionists were launching projectiles and beating people with sticks. And it's a video of an injured student. This is from UCLA. And next we have another video where we see a Jewish student who is supporting Palestine, if we have that video available as well.
Would you feel safe with a child, a Jewish child, attending a university like this right now?
Zionists who have entered the camp! Keep it moving, you Zionists! Keep it moving, you Zionists!
It is raw hatred towards Jews.
A student Star of David necklace was ripped off her neck as she walked to class.
One of my friends was physically held against the wall by hateful demonstrators because he was wearing an item that identified him as Jewish.
Unchecked anti-Semitism has become commonplace on Columbia's campus.
The university's inaction has left Jewish students abandoned.
There's actually quite a broad base of society which has some sympathy for the terrorists.
At some of these events, the chants have been F the Jews.
The protest was not labeled as an anti-Jewish protest.
I'm not asking what it was labeled.
And the Israeli government
The question wasn't what it was labeled. Columbia's leadership refuses to enforce their own policies and condemn Jewish hatred on campus, creating a breeding ground for anti-Semitism and a hotbed of support for terrorism from radicalized faculty and students.
So I'm afraid we might have had a bit of a mix-up there in the videos, but that was one from Elise Stefanik, who's a leader on the Republican side in the U.S. House of Representatives, who's been doing a lot in favor of the Jewish side of the sort of argument, I guess you could say. But where is this all coming from? I want to make a couple of suggestions. I don't know the right answers, but I think that some of it, from some perspectives, has to do with the push for decolonization in our universities. This organization called the National Students for Justice in Palestine, if you read into they've been around for quite a while. And if you read their mission and values, they talk a lot not only about the issue around the Hamas war, but they also talk about sustainability. They talk about gender freedom, Black liberation, Black with a capital B, all of these other things that some students are supporting when it comes to this side of the argument and these ideologies. I don't think that the war is this simple, but it's interesting to see how some of these groups put these things together. We see in the next slide, this was this group has been around since at least 2006, where they were talking about Israeli occupation, and they interviewed people from two sides, one from the Israel side and one from the Palestinian side. These were former reporters that were covering their thoughts on the occupation. But this is not just limited to the United States. It's also happening here in the UK. This is us talking about back to decolonization again. And actually, yesterday was the first day that I learned that some Native communities call the US and Canada, what we call North America, Turtle Island. And I was a little bit confused. I had to go do my research to see what that meant. Because of the trend towards decolonization and saying, well, we live on stolen land in North America, they're now going back to calling things the original traditional names that Native communities called it. And so I didn't really know what that meant, but we see a lot here. This is an article from Al Jazeera talking about the comparison between Palestine and Turtle Island. We see a woman there who's from Panama holding a sign in Spanish, Todos somos Palestina Libre, which means Free Palestine in Spanish. So we see again here that there's a lot of solidarity growing between anyone who feels that they've been colonized and that settlers came in and took their land away. So again, these parallels are starting to come out a little bit more. This is a group in the UK that is similar to the Students for Palestine group in the States. It's called Youth Demand. If you look at the background, you see that it was actually started with this used to be Just Stop Oil students, and they are now taking action against the Gaza genocide, but they also talk about their support for resisting new oil and gas drilling. So again, we see sort of the convergence of some of these topics that maybe some of us wouldn't put together. And here's one of their actions when they spray painted the Ministry of Defense in a march through London. This was just a couple of weeks ago, earlier in April. And we go on from here to see this. What is the reason behind all of this? Well, there's a couple of things going on here. I think the University of Edinburgh talks about they started their encampment over the weekend. So we see here the link to the Edinburgh University Communist Society. And so this is linked to the Edinburgh Justice for Palestine. And what is the relationship between these two? Well, I'm not entirely sure, but they are definitely working together. If we watch this video, this is from this weekend at the University of Edinburgh here. So what is particularly striking to me in that video is that it's being led by a very young child who's leading the chant, probably maybe 5 years old. So they talk about in these links to the Communist Party branch at Edinburgh University. They talked about their links to the British Communist Party. And I went to that website just to see if there was any mention of decolonization. And I did find a couple of results in my search talking about decolonization in the former British Empire and how that was some progress, but that we have more progress to make as well. You can also find there's a whole subcommittee on decolonization in the United Nations. And so then we can look at, well, where does that take us to? If we go back to our old friend, Professor Susan Mitchie, our friend from the COVID days, the Spy Bee psychologist, who is also a member, as we know, of the British Communist Party. And so there's an article from a few years ago on the UK column about a psychological attack on the UK. And I'm not necessarily saying that this is exactly what's happening now, but I just think it's an interesting question for us to think about. What does this mean for the West and this war that continues to kill far, far too many people? So I'm just going to ask the question based on this tweet that said, the problem with extreme left-wing governments seizing power is they cause the total breakdown of social cohesion, including this, quote, a global pandemic of hate infecting our universities must end. So just to ask the question, is one consequence of this war in the West a total breakdown of social cohesion? Brian.
Diane, thank you very much. Really interesting look at what's happening there. My goodness, so many questions, so little time today in the news, but we'll certainly come back to that. What I was very encouraged about is in our chat box, as you were talking, several people were saying it is all about division. And I think this is the key thing, that wherever we see one group of people being encouraged to be hateful towards another group of people, the chances are that we've got organisations in the background stirring the pot. And I think you've opened a very interesting debate here about who those people might be and what their objectives are. But the more chaos and confusion worldwide, the easier it is for the globalist hand to control people of whatever nationality, colour or religion. So I think we've got a lot more to do on that. But before we leave the subject, I'll just bring Mark Anderson in, because Mark, you discovered a particular protester who is a little bit more than he seems.
Indeed, Brian. We have a violent Columbia University protester who's, according to the New York Post, one of the few papers that digs behind the headlines. He's an heir to an advertising empire, lives in a mansion, model baby mama. I guess he lives with a hot chick or something, and a long rap sheet of all things. A trusted viewer, his view that he sent me in an email is there's nothing sincere about these so-called college protests against Israel and for the Palestinians. At the top, according to my friend, is organized Jewish interests, as he calls them, who have an anti-American bias and are feeding off the sympathies that some have for the Palestinians and feeding off the animosity that others have for certain Jewish interests, including the state of Israel, and they're aggregating these energies for their own agenda. So he believes that organized Jewish interests are infiltrating what's going on at Columbia and making it look worse for the pro-Palestinian people, to discredit them, to blackwash them. And so much could be said about this. This heir to the fortune that we're talking about, one of the most violent leaders of the Columbia University riots, he's being called, is allegedly a professional agitator and a limousine liberal. These are other words the New York Post is using. The scion of millionaire ad execs who owns a $3.4 million Brooklyn townhouse, and a stepmom dating John Cougar Mellencamp, a native of Indiana and well-known rock singer in America. And this guy's name is said to be James Carlson. So he's also called, Brian, a longtime anarchist, according to a high-ranking police source quoted by the New York Post. But it's just more proof positive that protests are not what they seem, and they're often loaded to discredit the very people that are putting them on. So back to you, Brian, and we'll continue.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for that. Well, I think that's telling us that we need to be very discerning when we see these things, because we know that in the Palestinian protests, there have often been many Jewish people expressing solidarity with the Palestinian viewpoint, and we can determine from that it will be in the best interests of powerful players to try and break that bond apart. But let's leave that subject and let's move on to health. We can't protect people's health by stopping the wars, but we can vaccinate people to become healthy.
Yes, I managed to become part of the stakeholder listening session preparation for the 77th World Health Assembly, which is taking place, as we know, May 27th through June 1st in Geneva. And this slide here shows the moderator, Mike Beer, the Chief of Staff of the Office of Global Affairs of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and curiously, Manuel Claros of USAID, which many have defined as the CIA front. I'll let the viewers decide that. And these are some of the speakers in this next slide, just to give a fair and balanced overview. Justin Bryce of the Interest of Justice on the left, he questioned the lack of debate on both health and climate issues, particularly the way climate issues feed into health issues. We've seen that coming up lately in many firsthand reports I've been doing for UK Column on the World Health Organization and the treaty and the IHR regulations. Rachel Cohen of a basically NGO named DNDI, formerly of Doctors Without Borders. She was a unremitting treaty advocate. And Liz Marcy of WaterAid America, more of a neutral party. Washing and sanitation are sorely lacking in the world, she says, and that needs much more attention, not just vaccines. And we'll move on from there. There's my mug as I gave comments to the listening session. I was only given 90 seconds because I only chose one item from the provisional agenda, Brian, and you were given 90 seconds per item. And I gave my 2 cents here, and I believe we have a 90-second video clip of me speaking to the listening session.
Next up, Mark Anderson.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. Good day. Thanks for this speaking opportunity on Immunization Agenda 2030. You are not going into the May 27 World Health Assembly with both eyes open. As you embark on Provisional Agenda Item 11.4, the WHO has made it crystal clear that it wants to vaccinate everyone, everywhere, its own words, thus indicating mass vaccinations have become a monopolistic centerpiece of global health, with painfully little said about real alternatives. Yet we've reached a point to where we know that the novel mRNA injections have caused widespread harm and more deaths than media and government care to admit. In short, as 11.4 is discussed, don't forget that the kind of highly experimental injections rolled out in 2020-2021 evidently will return during the next pandemic, turning people potentially into objects of experimentation once again. We must look at global health through a much more holistic and humane framework. Meanwhile, amid so many unexplored vaccination questions, I suggest that the current 11.4 Vax plan that will go hand in hand with the pandemic treaty and the IHR be put on hold indefinitely. We're told to trust the science, but any so-called science that simply comports with Big Pharma's profiteering plans is simply pseudo-scientific corporatism, not impartial science. So please cease and desist at this juncture on vastly overblown, highly experimental vaccine development for all our ills. Thank you. And that, Brian, was exactly what I had to say. An interesting side note is that the WHO and the DHHS and other affiliates have been talking a lot about disinformation, and comments like mine and others made by James Roguski, et cetera, at this listening session. This listening session was held this past Thursday, May 2nd. There was another one held further back on April 11th. But this is the kind of disinformation they don't want to hear. It's the kind of disinformation they're always protesting and saying is, a very damaging and corrosive influence on their utopian health plans. Well, they had to listen to a large chunk of the very disinformation that they loathe, which is a little bit of justice, you might say. And so that's a worthy footnote. And moving on from there, Brian, this next slide is another speaker. I don't have his actual visual video clip. It would have been audio only, so I took just a quote from it. This is Paul G. remarks to the same listening session this past Thursday. No new mRNA injection should be considered, Paul said, without full double-blind clinical testing lasting 8 to 10 years for each new proposed therapy. Emergency use authorization, he continued, for medical countermeasures was not justified for COVID-19 and should not be considered for future medical events. The HHS Office of Global Affairs should therefore cease and desist all negotiations on the WHO pandemic treaty and on any amendments to the 2005 International Health Regulations. That's what Paul G. had to say in part. The overall link, not just my comments, but the overall link to the listening session will be in the show notes, and listeners can listen to the entire thing and watch it, Brian. These are some other slides that round out what's going on, because right after that, Brian, the very next day, on Friday, May 3rd, they held a press conference, and it was in the wake of that listening session the day before, and I won't comment much about it. There's a photo. All the photos are original that I took with the screenshot function at the press conference. Here's a shot of the intergovernmental negotiating body that's working on the treaty, the co-chairs of it, Roland Dries and Dr. Precious Matsoso. And they gave a lot of comments, Brian, very general for the most part, that the treaty is generally coming along. They've got till May 10th to kind of get things square and get their ducks in a row. Yes, there's points of contention, they admitted, particularly around trade. And they didn't admit much else about the points of contention other than to say that they exist. So there's a little bit of a question as to how smooth things are really going. They don't really want to talk about it. They keep the cards close to their chest on that one. Anyway, I'll just conclude with this comment here. This is something I wrote as sort of a news brief. At the May 3rd press conference after the May 2 listening session, WHO treaty negotiators announced that if and when the treaty is consummated during the WHA World Health Assembly, May 27th through June 1st, then the process begins to seek the agreement's national level ratification. Thus, UK column viewers need to ring their lawmakers' phones steadily to make sure that viewers that would call the US Senate, viewers that would call UK Parliament, to make sure they seriously and proper conduct their constitutional duties. What I'm understanding, Brian, is only 60 nations need to adopt the treaty in the preliminary sense before the treaty is sent to Congress and parliaments. And remember, there are 194 member states involved here. And here's what Roland Dries, that co-chair of the INB, said: adoption is the beginning of the process, not the end. So that's a little bit of a glimpse as to what might be coming. But the main thing right now is that if they don't have their ducks in a row by May 10th, then that could possibly delay the treaty beyond the WHA starting May 27. We don't know that for sure yet. And these are just some reminders of how serious this is. This is a slide from last week. Back on April 24, they held an expanded program, an immunization program that I covered. And they're saying that everyone needs to be vaccinated everywhere. Vaccines are the only answer, or pretty much the only answer. And I believe we might have one more slide. I'm not sure.
No, I think...
Yeah, for now. So that's how it's shaping up, Brian. Some things are known, some things are about to be known, and there'll be more in the weeks ahead, of course, as the World Health Assembly and that May 10 deadline, as those things come up.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for that excellent report. Let's bring Alex Thomson back on, and you've got something to tell us about the vaccine scene.
I don't wish to detract much from Diane's important final segment, so a brief mention of two instances where the local level of government is saying no to globalization in health and health scares and threats, respectively. So a blogger in North Carolina, Tara Niebaum, is reporting in her Substack, and the links are well worth following, they're within the show notes, that a majority of the local parties at the congressional districts, the equivalent of parliamentary constituencies in the state of North Carolina, decided to ask their party, which is important, of course, because the Republicans are the natural governing party in a state like North Carolina. They have the majority. So the battle is within that governing party. So a majority of the local parties said they wanted the Republican Party more widely at state level and ultimately nationally to prevent a recurrence of medical tyranny. And this is the meat of it that's been found. There has been a resolution. It's only been so far submitted by one county Republican Party, Scotland County, on the state line with South Carolina, but it says we reject yielding any authority to unaccountable and unelected agencies such as the World Health Organization as being a threat to state and national sovereignty and personal liberty. And the call to action in Tara Niebaum's post is well worth following to see what kind of tortuous route this is going to follow in America's 3 or 4 layers of political authorities. Just an illustration of not having to give up on corrupt governing parties. Even if you are, as the Republicans have said in North Carolina, the dissenting minority, make sure you get your minority report in, because it then has to be considered, and it will be embarrassing to reject it too obviously if it's democratic. Meanwhile, in Italy, in the northwest of the country, in the region of Liguria around Genoa, 2 of the local authorities there, Lavagna and now Santa Margherita Ligure, have decided at mayoral level to decree that, there's the translation, that 5G is going to be switched off. They have set sensible thresholds to the electromagnetic radiation that people should be exposed to. And again, even within an EU context, and with Italy being only a lightly federalized country, usually it's central and EU authority that matters, even there, the mayors have said that, and they don't have as much power as US states and counties, but they are saying we will not have 5G radiation in our area if we have any say over it. So people have no excuse in Britain or wherever else they're watching from not to put pressure on their local authorities.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Well, let's end the news, bring Diane back, and you're just going to take us through some important things concerning immigration, which people might not be aware of.
Right, Brian, thanks. I will be brief. So I was in Sheffield last week for examining a PhD student at the University of Sheffield, and I was walking around the city centre during a break, and I saw this poster here. It made me think about the issue going on with Rwanda, with people potentially being removed to Rwanda if they are here illegally. And so this was something that was posted in a sort of a shelter area, I guess you would say, and I found it was through an organization called Migrants Organize, which is for refugees and migrants to organize for what they call power, dignity, and justice. And at the same time, I remember seeing this on Sky News a couple of weeks ago around a sex offender who was allowed to stay in the UK, regardless of, they're letting people stay whether or not they are refused or granted asylum because they think because of their behavior that it's dangerous for them to go back to their own country. We also hear a lot about people seeking asylum and what they are entitled to when they get here. They get money, they get housing, they get medical care, all of that covered. They get free prescriptions, free dental care, free eye tests, help paying for glasses. That's more than British people get who are in this country. And just from my own personal perspective, I am a migrant worker in this country, even though I'm here legally and I've been here for several years. But when I look at what happened when I had to come here, and I had to pay a lot of my own money to be here, and let's just go through the cost now. If I were to come here as a 2020, say that I had 3 dependents, which includes your spouse. So let's say that I was going to be here for 5 years with 3 dependents, 2 children and a spouse. The application fee for the 4 of us would be £5,680. The immigration health surcharge, which is new, and they've brought that in since I've been here, would be £26,380. So that is the total between the application fee and the immigration health surcharge between the two, $20,000 for health. After 5 years, you have to apply for indefinite leave to remain, which is settled status, which means you can stay here permanently. For 4 people, that would cost £11,540. You can pay more if you want add-ons like an extra fast decision, which you can pay up to £1,000 to get super priority service, if you didn't feel like you were paying enough money already. After having indefinite leave to remain for a year, you can then apply for citizenship. In my case, I can have dual citizenship. And for 4 people, that would be £6,520 for a grand total over 6 years of over £44,000. And that comes out of our own money, out of the wages that we earn. And meanwhile, we watch all these asylum seekers basically get in for basically nothing. And also, when you come in legally, you have to take a test called Life in the UK, which is a very difficult exam to pass. You have 24 questions. You have to get at least 18 correct to pass. And if you don't pass it, you can't stay in the country. You have to memorize useless facts, not about how to actually live in the UK. And you can't take this until you've been here 5 years. Anyway, you have to memorize things like the 6 wives of King Henry VIII and how they died or how he divorced them or how many children they had, whatever. You also have to learn the values and responsibilities of Britain, which includes obeying and respecting the law, treating others with fairness, things that I would call common decency. But at the same time, we're letting sex offenders stay here, whether or not their applications for asylum are considered. And so I really think that we have a very flawed tiered system here as a migrant worker in the UK. Brian.
Diane, thank you very much. Again, a lot of questions in that section. We'll come on to it in future UK column news editions. But I think we can be confident in saying that the crazy system is not accidental. This is orchestrated breakdown in UK for people to be able to take control and power to which they're not entitled. Let's leave it with that comment there. I'm afraid we got to the end of the news today, so we must finish. But my goodness, a lot of material in today's news, a lot of things to be discussed. And I think it is beholden on all of us to watch what's happening and to be discerning as to what is really happening, why it's happening, and who is pulling the strings of the puppets. We'll leave our audience to think about that. Thank you very much for joining us today. We will be back at the same time on Wednesday, but if you're a paid up subscriber of UK Column, please join us for extra time in a few moments. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.